every product company is very interested to see what generative AI is going to do and what impact it will have on their product. But equally, when we're working with our enterprise customers especially, there's a few things that we're seeing right now that are just pervasive. It's happening all over. The first thing is that every enterprise is looking, with no exception, is looking at how AI impacts them. It's coming from the C-suite. They're putting together internal teams. These are not just IT people. They're kind of ethics people. They're, coming from all parts of the organization, financial, HR, operations, etc. And they're looking at how AI will impact current workflows. And absolutely equally, every organization is 100% obsessively focused on the security implications of deploying AI. There is a noticeable increase of awareness, even in the last 3-4 months. About 6 to 9 months ago when ChatGPT hit the streets, well, it hit the streets about a year ago, but during that first quarter, there was a lot of kind of, as every hype cycle goes through this, a lot of kind of motherhood and apple pie type thoughts. People were thinking, is it going to displace entire, sections in companies? Is it going to displace entire roles? It's leveled out. People have a much better understanding of AI. Now you can go in and you can talk to the C-suite and talk about LLMs. You don't have to explain what an LLM is. Everybody knows it's a model. It's the brains behind the actual generative AI stuff. So that's great. So we're seeing a lot of more educated companies, better awareness, more realism. Especially, I was talking to an executive just last week, and he and I were chit-chatting, and I'm kind of tech, so I have an understanding of this stuff. He was not coming from that background, but this particular individual has been playing with ChatGPT and has been generating imagery. So the fluency and the understanding of what these models can, and more importantly, cannot do very well is dawning. And that's great. So security is the number one concern. And what we're seeing now is that the teams that are actually set up to investigate this stuff, which are a mix of kind of tech people and non-tech people, senior people where the business may get impacted, they are very much focused on the actual how this stuff will be deployed. They are still in a posture where basically any kind of interaction with external public cloud LLMs, GPT 3.5 or GPT-4 or Bard, if you're trying to interact with those in most of these organizations, you're blocked, you're locked down. So you cannot put content. And the worry here is proprietary content going into the cloud. It doesn't really matter the posture of the ChatGPTs. The reality is that those guys are also now delivering business offerings that are more suitable to many environments. Now, in our case, as VisibleThread, a huge part of the work that we do is in a highly regulated set of sectors: defense and space, IT services, healthcare. And in that context, our security profile is key. So most of our customers are not using our public cloud offering. What they're actually using is our customer hosted offering, either in a private cloud context or an on-premise context where it's 100% fully locked down. This is in the context of what's known as SCIFs, secure compartmentalized environments. Typically, you'll find these at play in highly sensitive areas like defense. And in that context, unless you can actually deploy an LLM into a fully 100% lockdown environment, you're out of luck. You're not going to succeed. And that's exactly what we tend to do with our software. It's fully locked down. So when you think about what's going on in the zeitgeist, everybody's aware of ChatGPT, OpenAI, but actually there are now, as of last week, there are over 368,000 LLMs available. That is a huge number. The vast majority of those LLMs have come about in the last year. These are becoming more specialized. They're becoming really good at, certain areas, especially, for instance, text summarization, auto-completion of imagery. They're being used in a huge variety of different contexts, gene editing, healthcare, predictive analysis, all kinds of stuff. But what we're seeing and what we expect to see will be those specialized LLMs, many of which are open source, have permissive licenses, meaning that they can be used in any context. Many of those LLMs will wind their way behind the firewall. In other words, in a completely locked down setting. So our expectation is that those LLMs will become what large enterprises who have an extremely cautious and quite correctly cautious approach to security, those LLMs will be what gets deployed. And that indeed is our future in VisibleThread. We will be deploying what I would like to call pocket-sized LLMs as part of our infrastructure, as part of our offering, and these will be 100% locked down.